I have a quick summary of what we're going to get into so you know what's coming at you, and then I'm going to dive right into what I hope will be a very innovative session. You'll learn a lot of things that I believe you'll be talking about at the water cooler right after the session. I certainly learned a lot in preparation for it. Let me introduce the guest real quickly. Todd Cleaver, you might recognize, doesn't look like the rest of us because he's a professional athlete. And professional athletes do look a little different, and we'll get back to that a little bit as we speak about DNA and big data. Raymond is VP of Sleep Sciences at Sleep Score, someone I've gotten to know quite well, really a world expert in the idea around technology and how we can use it to better our sleep. And we asked Sarah Reardon to join us. She's the head of science at Exploragen, because Sarah really can tie it all together. So we have the practice, what really happens in real life. We've got a very specific vertical in sleep, and then we've got the broad encyclopedia. I got rid of Google after I met Sarah. That will help us understand what's really out there. So I field a lot of pitches for the show, pitches for companies. And these days, I don't know if you all feel like this, but if they don't have the word AI, genes, DNA, or big data in there, they don't bother. And a lot of it's hype. And I wish everyone was as good as AI and big data and sleep as they say they are, but it is telling that everyone's using those phrases because we do have a belief that it'll help us, but does it really make a difference? And that's the goal today. Talk about what's really happening in DNA science. How does it really allow us to understand our behaviors and risk stratify so we can customize? What's really happening in big data that's applicable to the ailments we want to avoid and what decisions we make day in and day out. In fact, the decisions you make for the rest of today should be colored by what you hear on this panel. And then I want to ask our panelists, because they're on the cutting edge, to predict the future, which is always nice to do, if you can pull it off. And I think you'll hear some exciting options out there, ones that may tailored correctly could affect your businesses and your goals. So let's start off a little bit with the genome, Sarah. So I still remember when our human gene was first cloned, or not cloned, but identified. We now, on the show, are using it quite frequently for a very different purpose, which is solving crimes, which I'll come back to in a second. Bring us up to date on where we are on DNA science and how much it actually can be used to predict specific diseases, even ailments that are not so predictable, and how does it affect daily behavior because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we just last year celebrated the 15-year anniversary of the mapping of the human genome, and it took us over 10 years and millions of dollars to complete that project. Now a consumer can pay less than $100 to get their sequence done in a matter of weeks. So people have access to their DNA insights, and that's actually an incredible gift, because understanding whether we might be at increased risk for heart disease or cancer, we can actually take preventative action and get early screenings, make lifestyle choices. As a genetic counselor, I always tell people that your DNA is not your destiny. And so you do have the ability to affect change and take preventative action. A lot of people are familiar with BRCA1 and 2. These are breast cancer genes, and they substantially increase risk. But actually, there's a lot of other genes, like CHEK2, for example, that also affect risk. And so we now have the ability to do large panels with cancer testing and really get complete information about how our genetics can affect our health.
Roy, help us with sleep a little bit. This is an area where a lot of us appreciate. Some of us get up early, some don't. And within families, there are issues. Leonardo da Vinci slept 2 hours a night, somehow pulled it off, and didn't seem to hurt him too much. Where are we with understanding the role of DNA in circadian genes?
Yeah, so actually, so I think especially the circadian genes are the ones that in the sleep field are really well understood. So we kind of now know so why people wake up early, why people sometimes have the urge to go to bed early, so why some people are short sleepers. And what you actually can see is there are different kind of genes that work together like the wheels of a mechanical clock, and how they interact with each other, that kind of determines when you are early or late or short or long sleeper. So, but also that gets kind of impacted by the environment as well. So what we also know, our clock clock is kind of built in an odd way because it runs not perfectly 24 hours, but it runs a little bit longer than 24 hours. So the environments need to reset that clock every single day. And then it also changes so over age, because we probably all know that when we were in high school that we wanted to stay in bed for longer and wanted to go to bed later. And people think that high school people are lazy, but actually that's not true. It's just your genetic makeup that kind of changes going to age. And it of course goes back again to a great 9-to-5 rhythm so when you grow older. So you grow out of it, but that's all kind of dictated by your genes. Some of the things we need to know, there is this predisposition. You are either a lark or an owl, so a late person or an early person, and our society is designed to be the 9-to-5 people. And I think we should get a little bit more open-minded, so that if you want to have optimal performance or the best of your life, that you can actually live the life and give your performance as dictated by your biological clock.
So this is an excuse you could use when you go back home to defend any actions, malfeasance to your craft.
And it's better for your health.
It's better for your health if you customize. Todd Captain, former captain of the U.S. Rugby team, a legend in the field. I'm just curious. I was watching a national championship football game last night, and these guys are incredible athletes. And I assumed that they were probably doing DNA sequencing on all these athletes and using them to use that data to figure out who they're going to recruit for what. In your career playing rugby, did they ever sequence your DNA? Did they use it to predict what was going to be done with you, how they train you, et cetera?
I mean, it's changed a lot in sport and high-level sport, but and the short answer is no, they don't use DNA at the moment, strictly because you can't tell like the mental toughness. You can't see how much an athlete wants it, and those are the driving factors for players to get to the top level, to make professional team, to play international. So it's so it's a no. But in saying that, where sport was 20 years ago to where it is now. They brought in GPS units, so they know the training philosophy or each player, how many meters they run, how many miles they run, what's the acceleration, what's the deceleration. That's what it is now. Before, it was more, the more you left is the better. The more you ran, the better. This is a team, you do it as a team. Now it's very personalized of positional, what you want. If you're running back, you're working on more accelerations, decelerations, footwork. If you're a lineman, you do your squats and deadlifts and whatever else. So, and then it goes throughout the different sports. So it changes quite a bit.
I'm going to come back to that story of how we use information because it's part of the next big theme of big data. But I want to finish up with DNA. So, Sarah, you just heard a world expert, Roy, speak about sleep and his thoughts around DNA. But you have to correlate our DNA with disease and ailments that all of us, I hope, know are closely correlated, things like Alzheimer's, and ones that aren't so closely correlated, which maybe you can help us understand a few of them. How do you begin to tie that together, especially when it has to do with an ailment like sleep that is so clearly correlated with so many conditions, right? We all know that, I hope you know, that sleep is correlated to things like weight gain because, well, first of all, if you're awake, you can eat. If you're asleep, you can't eat, usually. But also when you don't sleep, you crave things like carbohydrates specifically, so you gain weight. But as a heart doctor, I had to find that and learn that a lot of the essential hypertension, essential meaning we don't know why it happens, hypertension was probably caused by sleep abnormalities. There are conditions I never thought, like cancer, that were correlated to sleep. So how do you put that together as a genetic counselor?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because a lot of the genes that are involved in regulating our circadian rhythm have also been implicated in our risk for diseases like type 2 diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome. So clearly there's a biological connection there. Our inborn chronotype, or whether we're more of a morning person or a night person, affects a lot of aspects of our lifestyle. So when I think about athletic training, there's studies that have found that athletes will train better in the morning versus the later hours of the day, depending on their chronotype. There's an emerging field of chronotherapeutics, which involves timing medication dosing around someone's inborn sleep cycle. So I think we're going to see a lot of developments in how our sleep DNA actually affects all areas of health and wellness.
Well, since you brought up chronotherapy, I was told by an oncologist that I trust that the timing of chemotherapy actually affects how often you'll survive the treatment. Is that true?
Exactly. So that's exactly what they're looking at. And if someone being able to time that therapy when someone's body is going to process that medication most efficiently based on their sleep-wake cycles. So it's early days in that field, but very exciting.
And so Todd could have been even a greater superstar if he knew that he was better in the evening than the morning for training,
Right,
in
yeah.
theory.
So there's a lot of potential for DNA to affect the way athletes train. Understanding caffeine metabolism and when your athletic performance is going to be maximized based on your caffeine metabolism, that can affect training. So I think there's a lot of potential.
Are you a caffeine drinker, Todd?
I am. Yes.
Doesn't bother you?
No, I mean, I took my DNA test and I kind of knew it. I mean, I'm able to have a dessert espresso and go to bed 20 minutes later.
Yeah, see, I'm the opposite. I'm a surgeon too, so if I drink any coffee, my hand shakes.
Yep.
It's very bad for the patients. Plus, this is the bad part. You have to go to the bathroom, which is even worse for the patients because you rush through because you got to go pee. Let's speak about caffeine and sleep a bit. This is something that a lot of the folks in the audience may not appreciate because some people really can't have any caffeine in the afternoon.
Yeah, so what we kind of know, and it's also, it's again genetically predisposed, so that there are a few genes involved in actually so how quickly so the caffeine is metabolized and how fast it runs through your body, so it can get so this kind of kick, that extra kick that you need. But it's only recently that we actually found that also the amount of caffeine that you take every single day then can change the effectiveness of the caffeine itself. And you can elaborate a little bit more on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. The more caffeine we drink, the faster we metabolize it. There's some other lifestyle factors that affect our caffeine metabolism, our gender, the medications we take, and of course our DNA has a large effect. So when you combine all of these things together, you can get quite a spectrum of people who can drink large amounts of caffeine at night and go to sleep and just be fine, and other people like me who have to stop drinking caffeine by 10 a.m.
Let me shift to big data. Todd brought up an example, and I don't know how many of you watch soccer, World Cup soccer. So you remember the last cycle, 2014. There was a German team report that explained that they won because 4 years earlier, in the 2010 World Cup, they had identified that teams that ran in a certain way, covered more of the field, seemed to do better. And so they changed their entire training system for the German team, and they won the World Cup in 2014 on a play that most of us thought showed a lot of grit and hustle, but apparently was based on big data and how they trained their athletes. And it comes to me back to the issue of precision medicine. And I like looking at athletes because you guys train your bodies, you understand every nuance of it. Most of the rest of us mere mortals just sort of identify directionally that we're headed in the right space. But what does science tell us about big data and precision medicine? And I'm going to walk that through sleep and then into performance, especially in sports.
Yeah. So we're already using DNA insights and big data combined to make huge strides in the diagnosis and treatment of disease. So take cancer, for example. We do DNA tests, we do other molecular tests, and we can actually construct a complete genetic and biological map of a patient's tumor. And that tells us, okay, well, what mutations has that cancer acquired over time, and how can we actually target those mutations with particular therapies? So, and we can actually serial monitor people over time with simple blood tests and doing DNA testing instead of doing invasive biopsies. So that's where we are now, which is great. We can go a lot further with applying big data to cancer treatment by actually understanding, okay, how does the food someone eats, how does that actually affect and cause genetic changes in the cancer? How does the environment, both the environment inside the body and external exposures, affect risk for cancer? And so big data can help us actually understand all the different biological drivers of cancer, both external and genetic, and then we'll be able to target those drivers.
Where does big data leave us with sleep? I know there's this large study, 1.3 million people.
Yeah.
It's still not published, but Roy knows the people who did the work, so you have breaking news for us, cutting edge news about what the study is showing.
Yeah, so one of the things, of course, sleep science is a pretty young science, as is genetics, and so we really do not know a lot about sleep and where sleep disorders come from. But this study, I think, is really an example of how it should go in the future. So what the authors actually did, there was a study with the principal investigators, Franz Sommer and Postuma. So they did a great study using DNA and also has some behavioral data. 1.3 million people were involved in that study, and they were looking for hereditary factors for insomnia. And insomnia is a kind of a problem area within sleep disorders, because if it's not any other sleep disorder like apnea or restless legs, hey, then it can be insomnia. So they tried to find out what is actually has genetically kind of the big influence for insomnia. And what they found is that actually the genes that they found were in that cluster were also overlapping with the cluster that has been seen in depressive patients and in anxiety patients. So there is something in there that links insomnia to depression and anxiety disorders, also already on the genetic level. It's not that surprising, because if you look to the diagnostic manual for mental disorders, you see that a key factor of a lot of mental disorders is sleep disturbances, but we never know whether the sleep disturbance is just a sickness or a disorder itself, or whether it's a symptom of a mental disorder. And I think with this kind of big data sets, having the behavior and the genetics will actually help us to unravel what's the mental disorder and what's a true sleep disorder.
Or could it be the opposite? Could it be that the lack of sleep is causing the mental disorder?
That's, again, I think, the lack of sleep is probably is changing the expression of the genes, and then can lead into anything else.
It actually changes, sir, the expression, so it changes the epigenetics of your genes if you don't sleep?
Yeah, so we've definitely seen this in a lot of different studies, more like test tube type studies.
Yeah.
We haven't actually been able to weed out all those factors in humans, but absolutely, our environment affects our DNA.
How many of you know what epigenetics is? Put your hands up if you don't mind. There are a couple of people. I'll give you the classic story that I've shared on the show, but because this is profoundly important. If nothing else, remember this. So I guess it was the winter of 1943. The Germans had taken over all of Northern Europe, and they controlled the Netherlands. And because it was the middle of the war, in the 43-44 winter, they starved the populace. Not on purpose, but the wartime economy, there wasn't enough food. And so women who were pregnant during that period were able to deliver their children, because the following summer, their food supply was eased. The war ended in 45. These kids grew up in a post-war, relatively well-nourished environment. And they found 20 years later that these young people, now they'd be reaching adulthood, had a much higher incidence of high blood pressure, obesity. They had developed a thrifty genotype. And it opened the eyes of scientists to the concept that we change our genes based on the environment around us, which sort of makes sense, because if the only way your genes change is because your parents made you a little differently, it takes a long time for us to adapt. But it turns out that your genes are changed by your environment. In fact, the grandchildren, so those children's children, they were also affected by that epigenetic shift, we believe. And so but I never thought sleep would do it. So if you're working shift work or chronically insomnia because you're drinking too much caffeine or whatever, that could change your genes in a way that could almost make it hereditary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How does that play a role in sports? The idea that, you guys are traveling all over the place, your time zones are shifting. You mentioned the GPS that's in your jersey. How far are we from seeing that used reproducibly to make the best sports teams?
Yeah, for an athlete or a team, it's all about, getting right for that game or that sprint or the race or whatever it is. So everything so if it's going to be traveling across the world and getting in time zones, you gotta, it's a challenge, and there's no way to fight against, sort of jet lag or whatever else, but you can, cure to it. So I see a lot of, benefits, using this and using DNA, and I definitely see getting that 1% that I spoke of before for these teams. And if you're a team of 11 like soccer or baseball 9 or rugby 15, everybody gets 1%. That's 15%. That team's a whole lot better. So that's how we're trying to get better to achieve on that game day or that race. If you're a 100-meter sprint, you got 10 seconds to prepare and travel across the world, all that. So I definitely think DNA is going to play a bigger role once we kind of narrow it down. If
I can push you, Todd, you mentioned earlier that a lot of success is mental, right? The mental resilience required to thrive, to persevere when others might not. So it's not just a physical element. But we know, and Sarah will talk about this in a second, that our behavior, our perception of reality even is in part genetic. I learned this looking at something called disgust. So not just disgust of smell, but also disgust of ideas. And in twin studies, there seems to be about a 50% correlation of how disgusted you are by a smell or by a person or by an idea with genetics, which I never thought that was even feasible. So if your genes affect how likely you are to be able to persevere, we don't even know that's possible, but big data would begin to reveal that to us. Then it might become part of the mainstay of performance.
Absolutely. I mean, if a coaches or a manager of a team looks into it and we're able to find that gene of it in the DNA, you can pick a team based on sort of the DNA making of it. Obviously, there are some forms where you got to find who's going to be a leader, who's going to be a follower, how are you going to build the team. But as you know, that's all part of the DNA structure. So it's playing a more and more role, and I do think in the near future that it'll play a bigger role.
Sarah, what do you think about behavior in our genes? Could we focus on eye color, other variables, but behavior, really?
There are studies that have looked at personality types and genetics and found genes that are associated with a more aggressive personality type or better able to respond under pressure, IQ. There's, of course, genes are not our destiny, and there's a lot of other lifestyle and environmental factors that come into play. But yes, genetics absolutely has a role in behavior.
Everyone put their hands out like this in front of them. And notice the length of your ring finger. You see your ring fingers? All right, so if your ring finger is longer, put your hands up. If your ring finger is shorter, the fourth finger is shorter than your index finger, put your hands up. Yeah. It's interesting because that's a gauge, right, of intrautero exposure to testosterone. So if your ring finger is longer than your index finger, that means that you have more testosterone when you're in utero from your mother. And probably from you too. So men tend to have a longer ring finger, and women tend to have longer index fingers, which reveals less testosterone exposure in utero. So there's these fundamental things we never noticed about ourselves. You're all smiling, some of you nervously. But it reveals, again, that there's things we don't know that we look at every single day, like our hands, which is why sleep to me is fascinating. Sleep Score, as you know, has the best sleep measurement device. We spend a third of our life not studying something so fundamentally important to whether we win a world championship, whether we can change the DNA that may not be ideal or maybe make it even more ideal. I mean, it's uplifting to realize we can do that.
Yeah, so but again, so I think it's sleep is also a behavior. So I think that coming back to your story, so some people have genes that are more relying on being comfortable. So that might actually also be a cause of having a sleep problem, yes or no. So I think what we need to do, because sleep is such a special behavior and you're unconscious about it, so we all need to get so at least our DNA tested, and get our sleep scores. Yeah. And that's available for everybody here in the audience, just to download it and get your sleep score and relate actually what you see from your DNA profile and to what you get from your sleep score profile, and then figure out what kind of sleeper you are yourself, because in the end, evolution would kind of taking care of getting rid of sleep if it wasn't important. But yes. It is important, and that's why we still need 7 to 8 hours. So.
What's the survival benefit of being unprotected for 8 hours a night?
Yeah, there's nothing. So that, even there is a very great hypothesis that actually insomniacs are needed to survive, because in your tribe there needs to be at least one insomniac. To make sure that you're not gotten beaten by any predator. So that might be also the genetic component to insomnia. But no, there is no need, of course, to be of this world for 8 hours. There is a big one. It's restoration, and it's getting your body prepared for the next day.
Just to follow up on that, there's this wonderful theory that it's a survival of the sickest. So all of the crazy gene abnormalities we have there for a reason. Sickle cell anemia is the classic one, but hemochromatosis, which is iron storage disease, is very common in Northern Europeans because if you had it, you couldn't get the bubonic plague, the Black Plague. So while everyone else was dying, your family survived. Unfortunately, when you're in your 60s and 70s, that iron can be a problem. But the bigger example is migraines. So 1 in 17 people have migraines, but people with migraines are hypersensitive to the world around them. So if one person in the average village, which used to be about 17 people, has migraines, they can see the saber-toothed tiger approaching, right? And then the other guy's not sleeping, they hear it too, and you make it. The other 15 of us sleep like babies, and we're good to go. All right, the future. The future. This is the part that I wanted to save a few minutes for. What is the next big health behavior, Sarah, that we're going to be able to correlate with genetics and using big data affect?
Yeah. There's so many. I think about skin, and we understand a lot about how genetics affects the biology of our skin, and being able to link, say, our risk for sunburn to our genetics, and of course how much we're exposed to sun, and optimize our sunscreen use, our skincare product use based on that.
Roy, big prediction about sleep and how we're going to be able to impact it, especially now that we have big data from Sleep Score and large studies like the one you mentioned with 1.3 million people. And Bobby, thank you he called the authors to extract under penalty of death information that we can at least talk about today because it's still unpublished.
So one of the things is I think that study really set the example how you should do it. 1.3 million data points of users, so both behavioral data and DNA. But especially I think for sleep it's so important because for sleep we mostly had treat or deal with the consequences of poor sleep, but not actually treating the true cause. So it's kind of, we try to get rid of the symptoms, but not the true cause. And I think the more we unravel the sleep behavior and combine that with whatever we see in DNA, we get to the main cause. And then we can actually go to what we say is precision medicine, so have the really targeted intervention for the people. So we did something with clock genes. They did a big study on insomnia, but we still have restless leg and apnea and narcolepsy, which are also diseases which are very hard to treat nowadays.
So I walked, I don't know if you've all been there, but the sleep section at CES, it's here in the Sands. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's a gargantuan series of exhibits, but I'm sort of continually impressed at how fast this field is growing. A lot of the nihilism, the sense of pessimism around sleep is beginning to dissipate. Are we pretty close to being able to figure out which of those many wonderful technologies will work best for us using big data and genetics? How far are we from that being a reality?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very soon that I'll be able to walk by a Starbucks and it'll say, oh, Sarah, you haven't had your morning cup yet. Based on your DNA caffeine metabolism, if you go in and have your latte now, you'll be optimized for your 2 p.m. workout and you'll still be able to go to sleep at night. Oh, and by the way, I just populated your Amazon cart with some more sunscreen because your sun exposure was up 20% last week and your DNA profile shows that you're more prone to sunburn. That's where we need to be.
And we need data for that, which is why, Roy, with your leadership, Roy was at Apple before he came to Sleep Score, but we actually now finally have big data to correlate with genes. Mm-hmm. And again, what does the Sleep Score app cost again? I forget.
So the Sleep Score apps you can download it for free.
So it's a free gift to all of you.
Yeah, so.
No more excuses. Last question. So as soon as the Eagles win the Super Bowl again, I'm from Philadelphia. There we go. The double Boeing, it will live forever. And the Philly special. But there's going to be another NFL draft. How far are we from entering into the draft, and not just big data about how high you can jump and how fast you can run, but really the DNA-based data and other subtle big data, information that will inform who they draft first?
I mean, everybody's familiar with the combine, with the workouts that they do, the 40-meter dash, how many times they can bench press 225 and everything else. I really believe the DNA is going to be part of that, because that's a draft pool. It's a pro day. It's going to be that. And then from there, it trickles down. It's going to be part of scholarships go to this. And so I don't think it's far off for DNA testing to make the best team, Super Bowl team.
Sarah, Roy, thank you for the information. We'll all be outside those doors if you have additional questions or if you want to torture Todd with some kind of physical challenge, he'll be out there. God bless you all. Have a good time at CES.
Thanks.